right, welcome back to your next episode of .LA Dives In. I'm Kelly O'Grady, .LA's chief host and correspondent, and today I'm joined by Jordan Husney, the founder and CEO of the retrospective meeting app Parabol. So welcome, Jordan, and thank you so much for giving your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I want to quickly set the stage here. We are obviously in the midst of a pandemic. We had a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel here in Los Angeles with some things starting to open up, but now restrictions are beginning to tighten again. And I think it has us all wondering, definitely myself, when we'll return to normal when it comes to our personal lives and professional lives. So I'd love to have a discussion with you around how we can best prepare ourselves for this extended work from home stint, given your work is so relevant to our current predicament. But first, let's get some context. So what spurred you to start your own company, and where did the idea for Parabol come from?
People would look at us very, very strangely when we said that we were starting a company that was going to help enable remote work. I think there was a lot of questions around why anyone would want to do that. I'd like to out myself as a recovery management consultant. And
me too, it's okay.
It's so nice to be speaking to somebody who's a member of the club. We used to spend a lot of time on airplanes, traveling around, chasing our executive clients where they needed to be. And I remember one day in particular where I was meeting a client of mine that their headquarters was in Fairfield, Connecticut. And this client, she had very, very limited time. We were both late because of terrible traffic on the interstate to get there. And she gave me a window into her calendar and shared that she just had WebEx meetings all day long. And she was going to be in like the giant WebEx theater that they had constructed with all the really big screens. It looks like the UN in there with a bunch of virtual faces. And I said to her, why didn't you just stay home on your couch and do this? And she brushed it off because other things were on her mind, but then I couldn't unsee it. And I had started to recognize among all of our clients, and this was back in like 2012, 2013, that all of our executive clients were de facto remote workers because their employees were global and they were showing up to the office out of habit. And I couldn't unsee that. And I thought, okay, well, this is going to keep extending. Like, we've never had video conferencing technology. More and more people are going to start to value the flexibility as knowledge workers, that you don't have to lug like heavy equipment into the office to get your job done. Sure. Or go to a factory and work on it there. We can just do it from our laptop, so we will. Of course, what I didn't anticipate was that we were going to be in the middle of the health crisis, and then all of a sudden everyone was going to see the world the way that we saw back then. And so now it's sort of like, welcome everyone.
Yeah, well, you've been vindicated. Probably not the way that you wanted to be, but it certainly has necessitated that. So we know why you started the company. I'd love for you to walk me through what Parabol does and how it adds value for remote teams. So how did it solve the problem that you identified with that executive in Fairfield, Connecticut that day?
Yeah, so I'd actually love to show you what the product does, because it's one of those things that it's difficult to explain in word pictures, but when you see it, because it's kind of a new idea, you're like, oh, I get it. Okay, I can imagine myself doing that. So
absolutely, go share screen.
Okay, so the first thing, we're on the Parabol website right now, and the challenge that we're solving for people is how to have really great remote meetings without the luxury of having a conference room. And who we cater to today are agile teams. So these are business agility teams or product development teams that work in a rhythm where they might start with a planning meeting, and then they'll work for 2 weeks, and at the end they're going to reflect and they're going to ask each other what went well and what could have gone better. The first hurdle that we got to get people over is the terror of introducing a new tool to their team. And so what we do is, on the website, there's a big orange button that I just clicked that brings people into a meeting with some virtual participants, with some robots. And what that does is it allows the first person to get really comfortable with what it is that we're sharing with folks, so
Mhm.
that they can then go and introduce it to their team and feel comfortable too. And we support lots of different kinds of meetings. And the thing that makes our tool very different is, in the world that exists today, most people are used to having a meeting where they just show up on Zoom. They're like the Brady Bunch, maybe they turn on the grid, and that's cool. It's great. But then after that, the success of the meeting depends on the talent of the participants in terms of their ability to facilitate the time that they spend together from when they join to when they end. And what we believe is that it's harder, first of all, when you're remote, because you don't have as many social cues. It's kind of hard
Mhm.
just to have the awareness of what everyone's needs are from the time. And the second thing is, um, leading meetings is really hard. And so what we try to do is we try to break down meetings into these discrete little activities that you can do that are actually fun and that lead you to a result that's always useful. So the thing that we say is
Mm.
that a meeting in Parabol is always worth the time invested. This kind of meeting is a retrospective or a lessons learned or a post-mortem. And the idea is you would run this meeting when you've completed a project or a work sprint, or you've made an investment in somebody, or the plane has landed, for the folks who use us in the military. And this meeting is, what new behavior should we adopt? What existing behavior should we cease doing, which we stop doing? And then what should we keep doing? What's working for us that we don't want to lose the next time that we do something? In our little interface, we have a little button that tells us when everybody has finished submitting feedback. You can actually hit the "I'm ready to move on" button, and
Mhm.
you'll see it unfilled there. And then we go to the next
Mm.
part of the meeting. And the next part of the meeting is the grouping phase, where what we do is we make sense of everyone's contribution. So we stack the sticky notes on top of each other. Then what we do is we get to vote on what it is that we want to talk about and really dig into as a team. And I really care about meetings and processes, and I care about the Slack edit, and I can tell when everyone's votes are done. And then what happens is all of the votes are revealed, and we can tell exactly how we want to spend our time as a team digging into one of these
Mm.
pithy um, bits of content, and the conversation will be centered on the things that people wrote down, and it'll really keep us focused on that one point of tension so that we can then go away and we can create these different tasks. It'll summarize the meeting for you, and it'll say exactly what tasks were given and then what the discussion looked like as well, and then you can forward that on to other people in the company, or it also comes out Slack, and you can add people to that Slack thread and share exactly what happened in the meeting. And we do this for retrospectives. We do this for team
Mhm.
status meetings. So we lead people through a really, really organized, awesome status meeting. And then very soon we're also doing planning. So if you've got a list of 1,000 things and you want to have a meeting to pare that down to the 10 most important things, that's the next thing that we're about to release.
That is so accurate that you get into a meeting and you have all of these different things that you want to discuss. Normally meetings I'm taking, let's say dot.LA for example, right? We're a company of 10, and everyone has different things that they're focusing on, and it is really hard to prioritize and draw those connections when everyone comes into the meeting with a different agenda. And oftentimes you leave the meeting and you say, oh, I didn't get to this, or we didn't dig deeply enough on that, and then you have to have all these offline conversations in order to connect the dots. And so this looks like this would be something that would really help that.
But we have this thing where every meeting has an agenda that you can start adding items to before you have the meeting, and it's really lightweight. It's sort of
Mm.
that thing where if you're on Microsoft Teams or Slack and someone's in a different time zone, or maybe there's a child care emergency that someone has, and they're just away from keyboard, but you need an answer from them, but you don't need it right away. You just don't want them to forget. the thing that people will do is they'll maybe send an email, which is really awful because that's probably going to get buried. What people will do in our system is they'll tack it on to the meeting agenda, and then they just know at absolute worst that that thing's going to come up in the team meeting when you hold it on Parabol in the next week. And so it starts to very subtly push your teamwork from depending on being fully synchronous, like meeting at the same time, to starting to like have these really dependable places to batch stuff up and then process it at the right moments. And it's what we want the product to be used as. We want people to start to realize that they can actually take their own time and make it more flexible. And I think that, Parabol aside, that's the thing that's going to start to happen more broadly, like the Pandora's box that's been opened in knowledge work, is that now that like we've been here at home, and some of us successfully or unsuccessfully or happily or unhappily have blended childcare, elder care, taking a walk around the block, picking up some food and enjoying it with our loved ones outside, like whatever it is, and we've realized that we can have this more tailored life experience. And like, you know, maybe the gyms will open up again. You can go to the gym in the middle of the day when it's not so busy, et cetera. Maybe, right?
Yeah.
When now that we have that, I think that now that some portion of knowledge workers will return to the office occasionally, if ever, we'll need these new ways and these new ways of communicating with each other so that we still have a cadence and things still get done in a way that's effective while we're enriching ourselves with the way we spend our time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you there. I mean, I think before all of this, we saw so many industries, so many companies. Like I was a management consultant, similar to you before, saying that's never going to happen. You need the FaceTime. You know, you need to be at the client site. You need to be building these relationships in person. I think LA, especially too, it's a very network centric, network focused, you know, region to be in, especially the startup community. Right? You're always meeting people, whether it's VCs, other founders, trying to build your network. And that feels like you can't possibly do that remote. I'm curious, you mentioned some of the pitfalls that people, that people get into when they're starting with remote work and how Parabol can fix some of this. I'm curious in general, what are some other pitfalls that you're seeing people fall into as they're transitioning from remote work? It could be, you know, manager side, employee side, but kind of what are some of those things that we should be looking for as we're transitioning?
One of the first things that you'll notice that people do is they take everything that was in an office and they just try to do exactly the same thing virtually, and then they get super frustrated because it doesn't work the same way. And a good example of that, speaking metaphorically, is imagine as though you've just met a client. Let's say that you're a salesperson. You've just met a client, and your first move might be have a telephone conversation or video conference. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to do like client site visit. You're going to take them out someplace fancy for lunch. And if that goes well, then you're going to try and get them out on the golf course. And you're going to go golfing and you're going to deepen that relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we see people do the equivalent of is we see them, they still have a video meeting. Then the next thing that they do is they like try and eat lunch together over the video meeting. And then the next thing that they do is they try and play like virtual golf with each other. And they're like firing up some golf video game together versus rethinking about like, okay, actually playing, you know, video game golf with your client is probably not the best way to deepen the relationship. You need to think about how is it that we can actually deepen the relationship in this new reality. So some of the things that we see folks really struggling with are when am I on? When am I off? That's super hard. And how do I actually broadcast what it is that I need from any given day? So many folks came from office cultures where they looked up to the boss to establish the cultural norms and have the boss direct what happens, that when you're away and the boss isn't looking at you, there's actually a responsibility on you to say, I'm starting work, I'm stepping away, I'm stepping away for lunch, I'm stepping away for the evening, or to start pulling on each other for um, uh, taking care of your work needs. Like, I'm stuck on you, I need this from you, et cetera, et cetera. That is one of the more subtle but serious challenges that we see when people are transitioning to remote work.
Yeah, and I guess I want to dig in a little bit deeper on on something you said about culture. Okay, so when you're in the office, oftentimes it's the leader, the manager of the company that sets that. I'm curious how Parable, and also from your experience just in the remote work world, how we can better build authentic relationships and build culture in a better way, than we had before potentially, and also just in general in a remote work environment, because it's so hard to capture those serendipitous moments when you're at the water cooler or you run into someone that you start to develop that relationship. Maybe it facilitates better collaboration with their department, or maybe it's just now you have someone who's an ally, a friend at work. That's so hard to do in this environment. So I'm curious what your perspective and advice would be on that.
So the way that I like to break this down is think about the way in which we built culture in the co-located world, and now what needs to that point at within the virtual world. And I really see the two buckets. Like, so one of those is that serendipity bump into a person in the hallway bit, and then the other is actually not to disregard the intentional culture that we were building within co-located offices. So these are like, how everything from as mundane as the all hands meeting to like the kickball league and the after work drinks and like interest groups that pop up and so on and so forth. On the unstructured side of the world, the serendipity side, I don't want to sound, like a total technocrat, but you can engineer serendipity to a degree. So, and this translates really well to co-located work as well. There's a company called dot.app, and there's another one that's called Lead. And both of those are plugins for Slack. Lead will also do Microsoft Teams. And what they do is they just pair two workers together who might work in completely different functions. And when they're installed, they'll actually see who's talking with who, and they'll actually try and pick people that don't run into each other very often, just so that they can set up some intentional time to chat with one another. There's another product that I really like that is really fresh. I mean, really like within the last 6-7 months, called icebreaker.video. And Icebreaker does something that I think is a very good intentional practice. And when you move online and folks aren't in the same room, you have to be way more intentional about this sort of stuff. What icebreaker.video does is it asks questions of escalating intimacy between two people. So there's a really wonderful New York Times article that was written that's called The 36 Questions That Lead to Love. And we used to do this as management consultants with our clients. Like, if we saw two executives at this, I would like sit them down and would be like, why don't you ask each other some questions to get to know each other? Icebreaker.video actually does that. You can have like a team retreat on it. You can put 20-30 people on it. It'll break people into pairs. You can decide what questions are appropriate for your culture, but it gives you this really great list of questions, and you can break it down, and people can get to know each other, particularly if they're new team members that have been hired in this world, just like you. So we actually engineer moments of sharing where the way it works in our culture, and there's some other businesses that have been remote for a long time, so like Automatic, Zapier, et cetera, where they have these rituals where at the end of some period, for us it's every Friday, people gather in one channel on our chat platform, and they just share something that they're proud of that they've done. And everyone can look at it. It's just a feed. You're not expected to look at everyone's thing. It's just ambient, but you get a sense of of belonging to something larger than yourself, and you just see all of this progress that all of your colleagues have made. And then what we'll do is we'll actually come in and we'll use the little React G in Slack, and we'll react to things that tightly align to our values or our objectives, and maybe we'll comment on them and be like, that's rad, that helps us with X, or that's a really good example of transparency, which is one of our values, etc. And that can really help with a number of things, but also just reinforce what the culture is and make people feel connected to one another. And the last thing is like, play some games. Like, there are some really great games on of different levels of involvement, from extremely casual, like you don't even need software for it. Like, you can play, I don't know if you're familiar with the campfire game Werewolf, where like,
Oh, yeah.
Two people are werewolves and they're villagers. You can bust that stuff out. You can play, there's code names online. There's the Jackbox game series is incredible, and they're having a banner year because of remote. And
Right.
being intentional to schedule that time. I think that's the main point, is like, create a box on your calendar that works for your time zones and get people together. But intent. That's the main message.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The idea that serendipity can be engineered, because I think that that's something that, you know, we're all kind of struggling with, of, oh, well, there's so many people in my company that I often work with and I interact with all the time, but those people that I would see in the hallway, but I don't actually have any business with right now, doesn't mean I won't in the future. I'm starting to lose those relationships. So the tools that you mentioned, I think, are really helpful. And I also appreciate the comment around intention. I want to dig one step forward, because I think that it sounds like you guys are very, very good at this, you know, creating this culture where you can just take an hour and have some fun. Sometimes, I don't know if you remember this in management consultant world, right? There's mandatory fun that a lot of, you know, consulting firms will force on you. And so sometimes we can look at that also as, you know, okay, we're getting together in a remote world, we're going to have a lunch together or pastries and coffee. And you'll have people come to the table thinking like, oh, this is just another hour on my calendar. And I don't really want to do this. I've got 50 million things and I've got a screaming baby or a howling dog in the background. Why am I doing this? So how do you create the culture and that I don't know, willingness to just jump in and dive in so that you can create those interactions that are useful?
Yeah. So let's start with what you said exactly. How do you create the culture where you can just dive in? And who was I listening to? It was, I remember it was the CEO of GitLab. And
Oh, yeah.
so he was saying how no meeting is mandatory and your attention is not mandatory. And that kind of blew my mind, because we don't necessarily share that same principle. But when he said it, it really forced me to think, and I'm still chewing through it. But basically, like, you can show up to a status meeting, and if you got to dip into your inbox and answer emails because that's drawing your attention and the meeting isn't valuable enough, you can. And that is so antithetical to the way that most people think about synchronous gatherings. However, if you start from that principle of, well, if you could design the way that you work to be fully asynchronous and you didn't have to depend on the meeting, where, I mean, think about like the status quo of working together in one office. What do people hate? They hate having their calendar chewed up with a bazillion meetings. That's the thing that everyone complains about. It's the thing that is like the universal among office work. So what if, now that you're in the remote context, you could start from a principle where by default there were no meetings and your work could be fully done on your own time. Then when you have mandatory fun time, people are kind of hungry for the social interaction. It's still, and I use the word mandatory just because I think it's a really funny phrase, but you don't make it mandatory. It becomes optional fun
Right.
time, and you just show up if that's, you know, what you need. And then if people don't show up routinely, then it starts to act as a signal for the coach or the
Mhm.
manager within that organization to be like, check in with them and be like, hey, is there anything you need? Is everything okay? That sort of thing.
Way. Jordan, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I found this discussion really energizing. I have a lot of tools now to go back and talk to the dot.LA folks about, make our, our check-in meetings more intentional, serendipitous. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, Jordan.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon, and stay safe out there.
Thank you. You too.